How precarious is the state of our elections? Welcome to Future Hindsight, where we take big ideas in civic life and democracy and turn them into action items for you and me. Because democracy is not a spectator sport. Tomorrow starts right now. I'm Mila Atmos. As we approach the 2026 midterm elections, now is a good time to take stock of the election landscape. Our guest is Anjali Enjeti. She's a poll worker, electoral organizer, activist, and novelist whose mixed race upbringing in the Deep South shaped her commitment to coalition building, social justice, and protecting voting rights. Her latest book is Ballot, which is part of the Object Lesson series about the hidden lives of ordinary things. Ballot examines the psychological, cultural, and political significance of voting amid rising anti-democratic forces. It is a timely narrative about the fragile state of our most fundamental right. And before we start, if you want to support Future Hindsight and all the work we do as an independent podcast, please join the Civics Club on Patreon. Head to patreon.com/Future Hindsight after the episode to join. Welcome, Anjali. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much, Mila. It is such an honor to be here.
So tell us about your work as a poll worker. Multiple guests have recommended that people should volunteer to be poll workers in order to gain a deeper appreciation of the electoral process. And we've never had one on the show. What does poll working entail, especially as we approach the 2026 midterms?
Poll working is really about service. It is a wonderful position to actually see the process of elections happening. I became a poll worker actually during the pandemic, and we were concerned about how voters were going to get to the polls, how they could do so safely before vaccines were widely available. But I also became interested in poll working even before 2020 because my state switched election machines to what is now ballot marking devices. And I had been part of a group of community members in Georgia who wanted to pressure our state to adopt hand-marked paper ballots, which are actually the most efficient and the least expensive way to vote, and also the most secure, because if there is any controversy about what might have happened to a voter's ballot, the ballots can be stored. They're on paper. They can be pulled out and analyzed. So I first started protesting our state's adoption of this outrageously expensive ballot marking election system. And when that didn't happen, I decided then, well, if I'm going to have to vote on these cumbersome ballot marking devices, I'm going to learn about what they are and what they do. And so I trained on these machines. A ballot marking device looks like a giant iPad. It's connected to a printer, and then a voter prints out their ballot and then has to go scan it. So I learned how to set up these machines and to break them down after Election Day. And it's just made me be more aware of how difficult it is for a voter to vote because they have to go through multiple steps. They're outrageously expensive. They're hard to set up. I have to go through a training every year. And so becoming a poll worker was the result of me seeing issues about how my state was going about getting voters to the polls and voting, and me wanting to at least be an expert on this process. If it was going to be a process that I was against, I was going to learn how to do it myself.
Oh, excellent. There are not a lot of people who do what you do, who identify the problem, then try to do something about it, or at the very least get better educated. Your book is part of the Object Lesson series. It's really a terrific, very accessible history leading up to where we are now and giving us a snapshot of our current moment as well as the leading up history. So how did this book come to fruition? Who's your intended audience? What were you thinking when you wrote this?
So I live in Georgia. I was living here in 2013 when the Supreme Court issued Shelby County v. Holder, which was the gutting, essentially, of the Voting Rights Act, specifically Section 5. And so I have been directly affected by the sharp increase in voter suppression laws and policies enacted in my state. Georgia began increasing substantially their attempts to prevent likely Democratic voters from voting. And it started with these horrific vote purges and accelerated. But what was sort of the inciting incident for me to sit down and actually write this book was President Trump's 2020 presidential election loss. Because when that happened, his team filed hundreds of lawsuits against the states that he lost, especially the swing states that he lost in, including Georgia. And he pressured Republican leaders in these states to enact even more harsh policies to make it even more difficult for voters to get to the polls. And so I was watching this activity happen and thinking I needed to write about it. And then the second thing that happened was I was gerrymandered out of 2 districts that I had worked to flip blue. I was in the 6th congressional district. I was part of the Asian American outreach team when John Ossoff ran for the first time for Congress in 2017. We didn't flip it with him, but we did in 2018 with Lucy McBath. And then after this most recent census, the districts were redrawn again. And I was drawn into initially the 7th congressional district, which was still majority Democratic, and then redrawn again to a majority Republican district, which would be impossible. Well, I won't say impossible. It will be very hard to flip this district blue in the next several terms ahead. So these actions that affected me personally compelled me to write the book.
So, well, Georgia obviously is a state that remains ground zero for anti-voting efforts, not only gerrymandering, but also in the wake of Raffensperger's publishing the call when Trump asked him to find the 11,000 plus votes. Georgia changed the rules for election certification and also managed to boot Raffensperger from the state election board. Tell us a little bit about how the election certification rules were changed and what the effect of that is.
So Brad Raffensperger is our Secretary of State in Georgia, and he is a Republican, but apparently he is too moderate of a Republican. And so even though he has been overseeing much of the voter suppression in this state, his standing up to Trump by publishing that phone call has resulted in him being targeted by Trump and his henchmen. He had served on the state election board, which effectuates Georgia's laws and policies. And this state election board, which was already predominantly Republican, the Georgia legislature decided to make even more Republican. So 3 of the members of this 5-member board actually believe that Trump won the 2020 presidential election. And so they started writing all of these policies, which is their interpretation of election laws in Georgia. And they proposed policies for hand counting the votes. At the end of the day, they've proposed policies where any voter can challenge another voter's vote. They wanted to delay certification as long as possible. They've proposed policies to say, look, if you're suspicious of whether or not the right voters are voting, we can just sort of delay certification of that precinct's votes and then just go ahead and count the votes from everyone else in that particular county. So just these wild rules, many of them have still not gone into effect, thankfully, but it just really a complete disrespect of any voter having their vote counted. Now, I think the thing to keep in mind is even though they are, for the most part, an extremist board, there is a Democrat serving, but they are just really putting Republicans' sentiment about what happened in the 2020 election into something more concrete. they are all operating from the belief that there was voter fraud in the 2020 election. And to put that into practice, they are essentially trying to curb as many likely Democratic voters, specifically minority voters, from voting. I mean, one of the rules was you could be challenged by anybody. So any voter walking into a precinct can say, hey, my neighbor, they are not eligible to vote in this precinct, in this county. And then election workers and the state election board and the county election boards have to resolve that in some way. They are just erecting these unbelievably large barriers for voters to have their vote counted. So the voter works first to get to the poll, right, to work around childcare and working hours to get to the poll. But then their vote that they cast still might not be counted. And that's been the goal, right, to prevent likely Democratic voters from having their vote counted. And groups like the state election board in Georgia are just finding any way to prevent these votes from being counted.
Right. Well, but one other issue, of course, and we've discussed this many times, voters are not only experiencing the possibility of having the votes not counted, but also we have really very low election turnouts in general, but especially in the local and state races. We are really big proponents of emphasizing the importance of local and state races, and you wrote a whole chapter on it. And like I said, they're normally anemic in turnout, but this is actually where the voter has the most political power, and you actually call out Raffensperger's trajectory from your very own suburban Atlanta's nonpartisan city council to Secretary of State. So these positions really do matter, and maybe if more people voted in local elections in Georgia, you might have a better chance to get another Democrat onto the state election board. But tell us about your front row seat experience to seeing Brad Raffensperger become Secretary of State. What's something that we can all take away?
You know, I live in a northern suburb of Atlanta and was very active in participating in city council politics. I would attend city council meetings. I would pay attention to whatever issues would come up before the city council. I was part of a large group of community members who did so. And Raffensperger was serving on the city council when I attended some of these meetings, and he seemed very reasonable and oftentimes on the side of the residents. And then he ran to be a state representative, and then he served there for a few years and became Secretary of State. So to your point, Mila, local offices have for many decades been launching pads. By serving on city council and county commission or as a state representative or a state senator, local offices are what impact the day-to-day lives of voters, and they're not paying attention to it. You know, when COVID happened, we saw a lot of decisions being made at the city level and the county level and the state level. But it's been really hard to bring up the turnout. And one of the reasons it is hard is because local elections, at least in Georgia and in many other states, are not scheduled during other major elections. They're not scheduled during midterm elections. They're not scheduled during presidential years. And this is by design. I mean, this is something that can be fairly easily corrected by a state or even a city.
Yes.
Yeah.
Well, New York, for example, just voted
Yes.
on it in the last election. And so now municipal elections in New York will happen in presidential cycles. So disenfranchisement clearly is a really big theme in the U.S. system, which might come as a surprise to a lot of Americans. We know, of course, that many ex-prisoners cannot vote, although that's not true in every state, and also that the District of Columbia should have full representation. It has a population of 700,000. They also don't have a senator, and they have a non-voting delegate in the House. And we've had a bunch of conversations about these before on the show. But let's discuss voting rights for U.S. territories. That's a conversation we haven't had. You call out that Puerto Rico, Guam, U.S. Virgin Islands, Northern Mariana Islands, and American Samoa have very strange voting rights. They're kind of bizarre, almost non-existent, but there is some voting. What are the voting rights that they have, and what should they have?
The U.S. territories do not have meaningful representation in Congress, meaning they don't have someone who can vote on legislation on the floor, which is interesting because a very high percentage of residents of American territories serve in the U.S. military, but they don't have a meaningful voice in the federal government. Someone might say, well, they're not states and they don't pay taxes. They do actually pay taxes. I mean, if you have a business, a small business that is not tied at all to getting anything from the mainland, well, you pay fewer taxes. But otherwise, they are a people with very limited rights and are wholly disenfranchised. And it is my belief that they should have representation regardless of statehood. It's not a super popular belief. I'm sort of rolling a boulder up a large hill here. But, they are, along with Native people living on Native lands, along with, as you mentioned, residents of D.C., just completely disenfranchised and not represented at the federal level. And, we're talking about millions of people who are wholly affected by U.S. laws and policies not having a voice in the federal government. And this would change elections. Now, we don't know for sure how it would change elections, but certainly if millions more people are voting for congressional reps and voting for president, obviously that could change significantly the course of our government.
Yeah, just for the record, the combined population of these territories is about 3.6 million.
Mm-hmm.
We'll be back with Anjali in just a moment, so stick around. You'll want to hear this episode's Civic Spark. One small step we can all take to be more empowered and ignite collective change. But first, 2026 is the year you launch your business. Yep, you heard me right. It's the year you transform into an entrepreneur, founder, boss. One powerful move puts your future firmly in your hands, and that's starting a business with Shopify. Maybe you've got an idea you can't shake, a craft everyone tells you to sell, a store you've already designed in your head. With Shopify, 2026 is when you finally make it happen. Shopify gives you everything you need to sell online and in person. And that's why millions of entrepreneurs have already made this leap. From household names like Gymshark and Alo Yoga to first-time business owners just getting started. Shopify gives you all the tools to easily build your dream store. How great is that? Choose from hundreds of beautiful templates that you can customize to match your brand. And setup is super fast, with Shopify's built-in AI tools that write product descriptions and headlines and even help you edit product photos. Marketing is built in too. You can create email and social media campaigns that reach customers wherever they scroll in the blink of an eye. As you grow, Shopify grows with you. Handle more orders, expand to new markets, and do it all from the same dashboard. In 2026, stop waiting and start selling with Shopify. Sign up for your $1 per month trial and start selling today at shopify.com/hopeful. Go to shopify.com/hopeful. That's shopify.com/hopeful. Hear your first cha-ching this new year with Shopify by your side. And now, let's return to my conversation with Anjali Enjeti. So, there is a really hopeful story in your book about the WNBA's Atlanta Dream campaign that helped elect Reverend Warnock to the Senate. And this is a story that I had not heard about the power of their grassroots efforts. Mm-hmm. I'd love for you to share what the WNBA did and what are the lessons for organizers going forward.
So this is one of my favorite stories to talk about, actually. So I really appreciate you asking me this, Mila. The WNBA is the perfect example of what grassroots electoral organizing can do, especially when it comes from people who are not bought by campaigns, when it comes from an authentic place. So Senator Isaacson retired. And Georgia Governor Brian Kemp appointed Kelly Loeffler to finish the rest of his Senate term. There was going to be an election, though, on the general election day in November of 2020. So Loeffler had some time to serve her term as a senator, and then she was pretty much having to start her campaign to run for the same seat that she held again. As it turns out, Senator Loeffler was co-owner of the Atlanta Dream, which is Atlanta's professional women's basketball team. And this basketball team did not want her reelected. Now, the election that was going to take place was what was called a jungle primary, which basically meant that anybody who wanted to run could run, and the top 2 vote getters would have a runoff. So Loeffler was going to run, and Doug Collins, another Republican, was running, and a bevy of Democratic or independent voters were running, and one of them was Reverend Raphael Warnock, who is a pastor at Ebenezer Church, and he had been most recently appointed to the New Georgia Project after Stacey Abrams stepped down, but he was largely an unknown, right? He was known for his civic service, certainly, and his church did a lot to help get out the vote, but otherwise he was not widely known in Georgia. Well, the Black Lives Matter movement was ongoing in 2020, and Loeffler, of course, despised it and disparaged it. So her own team that she co-owned decided to come out strong for Reverend Warnock. They started wearing black T-shirts with white lettering that said "Vote Warnock" on it. And they were doing press conferences, and they were asked about these T-shirts and asked about the election. And this sort of media campaign raised the awareness of voters in Georgia that, oh, there's something called a jungle primary happening, and here's a Democratic candidate that the Atlanta Dream supports. And so when they started wearing these T-shirts and speaking out, donations to Reverend Warnock's campaign soared. And in the November election, the top 2 vote getters were Kelly Loeffler. She got some more votes than Warnock, but he was in the top 2. And by then, Georgia was sort of the deciding factor as to whether the Senate would flip blue. So by then, Warnock was getting a ton of attention, but it was their work that they were doing independent of the campaign on their own terms that raised his national profile, and especially raised his profile in Georgia. And I credit the Atlanta Dream with getting him elected to the Senate and flipping the Senate blue, because if they had not publicized his campaign, and if they had not gone on the attack of Kelly Loeffler, which was also very effective, he might not be sitting in the Senate now.
Yeah, that was really, really effective. Of course, since I don't live in Georgia, I did not really pay close attention to the state of Georgia and the runoff elections, although, of course, like you said, that got a lot of national attention towards the end. So there are so many structural reforms that we need in the U.S. electoral system beyond 2026. So, for example, eliminating the Electoral College, undoing Citizens United, and you actually reference a suggestion by the political scientist Eric Orts. He recommended that each state get 1 senator and then the rest to be apportioned by population. How would this work? Tell us more about how the Senate would change.
So, as most people know, the Senate representation is not determined by population. Every state, no matter how large or how small, gets 2 U.S. senators. And the states that tend to have lower populations tend to be whiter. Wyoming, for example, has a very small population. It is majority white, but it gets 2 U.S. senators. And D.C. doesn't have any U.S. senators, and it is majority Black and other minority voters. And so what this proposal does is equalize voting power across states. If we use his formula, Florida, for example, and Texas would have a lot more representation in the Senate, and these are states that are still predominantly voting for Republican candidates.
Sure. But for example, you would also have California,
yes,
which has something like 40 million people, as opposed to Wyoming, which has 600,000 people.
Absolutely.
So I think the representation would be much more robust. No matter how
Yes.
their party affiliation would be, it would still be more representative.
Absolutely. I mean, the largest cities in the country are in California and New York and Illinois, and these very blue states can still only send 2 members to the U.S. Senate. So the electoral landscape would look completely different with fair representation in the Senate. And it would be quite a force to enfranchise voters and change the entire body of the Senate if more voters actually got to be represented more fairly in the Senate.
For sure. So you write about the 1835 Treaty of the New Echota that promised the Cherokee Nation a non-voting House delegate. And now, of course, nearly 2 centuries later, Congress still hasn't delivered. And you mentioned earlier about the voting rights of First Nations. So even if Congress were to deliver on this, though, what would this do for First Nations? And how is this different from Native Americans voting in general?
So, as you probably already know, Mila, some of the most disenfranchised people in the United States are natives, and they've been promised representation and have never received it. And they're disenfranchised in myriad ways, not even just not having representation in Congress, but also it is so difficult to vote when you are native living on a rural tribal lands. First of all, many homes don't have a traditional address with a house number and a street name. They are very far from post offices to mail back mail-in ballots or absentee ballots. You might have to drive an hour to cast your ballot, an hour or more, right? So already this is an issue. But secondly, it is the bare minimum, honestly, to give these tribal states representation in Congress. They have been on the receiving end of genocide and oppression for hundreds of years now, and their needs are not being met by members in Congress right now. And the largest First Nations should have representation in Congress. Smaller First Nations should have coalitions where they also have then representation for that coalition. These are ideas that are not originally mine, but Native voters have been saying this for years. They should be treated no differently than U.S. territories should be treated in terms of having a voice in their federal government.
Yeah, thank you. So you have done so much work in researching this book and being involved in city council and also being a poll worker. And every week on Future Hindsight, we ask our guest to share a civic spark, one small step we can all take to be more empowered and ignite collective change. Your book connects identity to sustained activism and not just sporadic voting. So what's your civic spark for turning the insights you've shared into year-round civic engagement?
I think the most effective kind of organizing happens at the most local level. When people are in political overwhelm, they're often frightened about forces that are very large and missing the fact that an act as small as picking up your neighbor on the way to your polling place is a huge act of voting rights and enfranchisement. Getting together people in your neighborhood and deciding to all go vote on the same day. Becoming a poll worker in your county. So I suppose what I'd like to remind people is that a lot of scary things are happening in the United States, but it really is the small acts that add up that change a nation. It really is about texting your friends about a primary election that they probably don't know is happening. It's about explaining to them what a primary election is. A lot of voters don't know. They're paying attention to it at the presidential level, but certainly not at the state level to the degree that they need to. One voice, one person really can change the entire electoral landscape. We don't have to wait for Congress to do something. We don't have to wait for a president to lead on this. We can lead as individual community members, as voters who go to the local high school and register students to vote, who send links about election information, that could be circulated in WhatsApp groups. This is the real work, and we all can do this work. We can all empower each other. We don't have to wait to elections to do it either. We can educate people about the electoral process year-round. We can tell voters, okay, now you voted. Now let's hold our elected officials accountable. And it really is as simple as creating a text group with 5 people and talking about this and informing one another.
Yeah, well said. I just wanted to shout out for people who live in New York State Senate District 47. There is a special election on February 3rd, which I only discovered in the last few days. So February 3rd, there's a special election for State Senate District 47. There's a vacated seat because the person who was the state senator for this district is now the Manhattan Borough president. And it's the kind of thing where it didn't occur to me, of course, that this seat would be vacant. And now there are a lot of candidates. And it's totally under the radar. So, last question. Looking into the future, what makes you hopeful?
Well, I'm going to be totally honest here. I was not hopeful during most of the year that I wrote this book, which was 2024. What has made me hopeful is the campaign and the win of Zohran Mamdani. This was a local election that typically had very low turnout. You would think that in cities like Los Angeles and New York City, there would be higher turnout, right? There's a lot more talk about it. There's a lot more publicity. There are debates on television. You would think that would be the case, when the reality is even in our large cities in the United States, local elections still barely cracks 25% turnout. So what I found inspiring was that Mamdani's election brought a much larger turnout. Something like 50% or more voters turned out to vote in the mayoral election. And that tells me a couple of things. One is that voters will turn up if they are inspired by a candidate. They will do whatever they can to get to the polls. And yes, we still need much more higher turnout. But a candidate really can speak to people of various racial and ethnic groups, of various faiths, of various even politics, and change and win an election. So I think what we need to do is take inspiration from this race and take a look at the members of our community and see what kind of candidates we really want to put up to run and support them.
Yes, hear, hear. Well, thank you so much, Anjali. It was really a pleasure to have you on the show.
Thank you so much. It was such a pleasure to be here. You all do amazing work, and it's an honor to be a part of it.
Oh, thank you. Thank you so much. Anjali Enjeti is a poll worker, electoral organizer, voting rights activist, and the author of Ballot. Remember, civic action doesn't have to be complicated. It's about small steps that spark progress, like sharing this episode with a friend. Let's recap this week's Civic Spark and fire up our collective power. Organize at the local level. We say it all the time, but there's a reason for that. We start local because the small acts add up. They build community, and they help us build a foundation of power. So pick up your neighbor on your way to vote, start a civics club at your high school, make a group chat, and keep each other updated on local elections. Just pick something small and run with it. Next week on Future Hindsight, we'll be joined by Elaine Landemore. She's a political theorist and professor of political science at Yale University. Her new book is Politics Without Politicians, The Case for Citizen Rule. That's next time on Future Hindsight. Now, be sure to follow us on your podcast app so you'll never miss an episode. And if you're listening on your browser, you can find Future Hindsight on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or any other podcast app. We're here to build your civic action toolkit every week. So follow Future Hindsight now, and we'll come right to you. And if you want to support Future Hindsight and all the work we do as an independent pro-democracy podcast, please subscribe to the Civics Club on Patreon. Head to patreon.com/Future Hindsight now to join. Thanks for tuning in, and until next time, see clearly, act boldly, and spark the change you want to see. This episode was produced by Zack Travis and me.
This podcast is part of the Democracy Group,